In this presentation, I want to introduce you to visual fluencies. Visual fluencies are something that I like to call the conventions that we are accustomed to using when we're looking at and reading images that are created in 2 dimensions. This could be anything from, say, like a poster to a painting, or to surfing the web or scrolling through your socials. And the goal of the project is to slow down looking. So one of the things I want to assert to you is that you already possess an incredibly sophisticated way of reading and understanding two-dimensional imagery. You're so good at it. You've been doing it for so long, you don't even think about it anymore. And so what I want to try to do is slow down how we see what we see in terms of reading images. In this project, you'll use one of 4 conventions without relying on your gut instinct or your very fluent understanding of two-dimensional representation. And what you're going to do is you're going to communicate a meaning or a message. In the lecture, I'll attempt to give you a broad introduction to some of the visual and linguistic conventions that we use every day without even thinking about it. For example, these guys, you may or may not recognize. They are from an animated television show, and all they are is a series of lines, shapes, and colors. But somehow we can translate those guys into characters with emotions, personalities, and so on. The first option that you'll have is to create a metaphor. And what you're going to do is you're going to create a digital image where you use a metaphor to communicate a moral or a cultural value. And this could be notions of beauty, love, heroism, strength, or whatever. And you'll create an image that metaphorically communicates something about this value, as opposed to, say, illustrating it. The next convention, and these are typically the words that I'm using here, they sound really fancy, but they're typically used in linguistics. But they can also be mapped onto the way we read images because they share a lot of the same cognitive practices that we use both with speech and also with images. So the way you say this is synecdoche. And a synecdoche, the easiest way to remember it is kind of a part-to-whole relationship. I'll show you examples at the end of the lecture. You're going to create an image or a collage where you consciously use synecdoche to communicate an opinion or an observation about a historical or current event. Remember that synecdoche is part-to-whole relationship, so you'll need to use visual element from this event to stand in for that event. How you choose to represent this is up to you. The way you do this last part will also communicate something to us, like your relationship to the event, what you think about the event, or your opinion about the event. Option 3, metonymy. Create an image collage that is using metonymy to communicate a message about a product or a commodity. Metonymy is the best way to think about metonymy is that it's sort of associative. So, for example, advertising uses metonymy quite frequently in the sense that they will pair, say, somebody famous or somebody who has an expert view, like a doctor, and will associate that expertise with whatever they're talking about. So remember that a metonymy is a way of conceptually linking one thing to another by mentioning or showing that thing or concept related to it. So it's associative. Think about how advertising positions different elements in an image, and they draw links between their product and the way of life or qualities of that life. Irony. Create an image or a collage that employs irony to comment on a cultural phenomenon or a news item. So, oops, I have a typo there, but irony is kind of easy, and it pervades a lot of social media and reels and that kind of stuff. it's a mode of speech or expression which we already know inherently. It's kind of hard to put words to, though, because you know how it works, and it sort of relies a little bit on sarcasm, where the meaning is contrary to the words that's spoken, but you know that it's linked by way of having an opinion or kind of showing something that is obviously apparent. It's kind of like a takedown to a certain extent. So you're going to create an image or a collage that employs irony to comment on a cultural phenomenon or a news item. Remember that irony is the easiest of all conventions to use and rely on. Irony is a mode of speech or expression in which the meaning is contrary to the words or actions spoken. And it's saying one thing, but you're meaning an entirely another. As with all our projects, you're going to have a written analysis and a description, and this post will go on your site. And I'd like you to also post it in Canvas. So please load the image to your site. You're going to need to add it to your library in Wix if you're using Wix or another web builder. And you can do it on a separate page, or you can put it underneath your image if you want on your post. And then I'd also like you to upload the image to Canvas. And then the other thing that we're going to do this time is we're going to also post it in the discussion forums, and I'll create a forum where you can post your image when you're done, and then we will have some feedback to one another on the items. So I'll give you more details on that later. Again, this should be relatively straightforward. It's the same for all projects. All right, so one of the things that I'd like to start out with is a presumption. And the presumption that I'm going to make to you is that representations, in other words, not the real thing, but the stand-in for the thing, dominate how we operate in culture and art and everyday life. And so the other proposition that I'm going to make to you is that those representations aren't culturally neutral, that they come from somewhere. Sometimes they have an ideological position, sometimes they have a political position, but they're never innocent. So representations are never just what they seem. They always come from somewhere, and that somewhere has a point of view, okay? And so we assume that representations or images involve an ideological position at some point in their creation, or maybe later in the ways that they're used. Then discussions about form, content, and style or meaning could be about more than just what it looks like or aesthetics. When we live in a world that relies so heavily upon representations like credit cards, ID cards, checking accounts, birth certificates, and images, then who does the representing becomes really important. I also want to introduce you to well, it's a field of study, but just for this project, I just want to introduce you to the concept of semiotics, and the study of semiotics is the study of signs, signifiers, and what that signifier is meaning, and the codes that we use. So, for example, I'm speaking English right now. English is a code, it's a code of language that you understand. A word might be a signifier, which signifies or points to something, right? A sign might, in that case, if we looked at written words, might be the word itself. It could be an image of that thing, right? So, for example, if you received a red rose from somebody, that might indicate like a love interest or maybe like a romantic interest. But in this case, the red rose is the signifier. It's the pointer to the thing. That's the meaning that wants to be conveyed by that person. And the signified is the thing that is being pointed to. So it's kind of a coded meaning that you have to unpack and interpret, right? So semiosis is what it's called when we interpret that kind of coded practice where things are used not as exactly what they are, but as a representation or as a pointer to something else. And so semiosis also always includes that interpretive process. One way to think about this in terms of images is to consider them as messengers and messages, all tied together into one. Okay? And sometimes, especially in propaganda, we conflate or we mistake the way that the messenger is dressed. Let's pretend it's a real messenger at your front door, as the meaning of the message, right? And I'm going to make the argument to you that when we do that, it could be that that is the intent of the message sender to confuse you a little bit. And that, in some ways, is a metonymy, right? It's an associative thing. So if somebody comes to your door and they're dressed nicely, you might associate them with respectability or whatever. If they come to your door wearing work duds, you might think they're a gardener or something along those lines. So what I thought I would do is go over some of the pictorial conventions used by artists and pretty much understood by everybody that are called signs. And signs are like stand-ins for meaning, right? Just like words are. There are different types of signs, and the most common type of sign is icon. They kind of look like what they represent. And in many respects, the icons we don't ordinarily associate the icons with any kind of an ideological or intent, or an ideological intent on the person who's using them. I'm gonna switch up how Scott McCloud talks about symbols, and I'm gonna argue that symbols are a representation of an idea. And so symbols are used to send other messages, right? And what's important to remember when using symbols is the success or clarity of what you want to convey depends largely on whether or not your audience understands the symbol that you're using, right? So it has to do with shared code. Now there is something called structural semiotics where things are taken very literally. And since the movement towards semiotics happens in the late 19th century, you start to get an elaboration on it. But I'm not going to go there yet. I just want to say that when McCloud uses the idea of an icon and a symbol kind of interchangeably, I want to make it more specific and say that an icon is a more symbolic. An icon can be symbolic. When it's symbolic, it's a pointer to a meaning that is more about an idea, okay, or a belief.
仿佛一切都没发生过。历史事件的含义不会自动呈现出来，而总是由人来解释的。6月5日清晨的这一瞬间将成为永恒的历史象征。后来，他消失在人群中，下落不明，连姓名都难以确认。对于全世界千百万的电视观众来说，这一时刻的含义非常清楚。这是人类良知与勇气在向无情的国家机器挑战。中国政府对这一场面的解释。
That was an image of, I believe, a professor who was trying to stop a line of tanks to quelch a democratic demonstration in Tiananmen Square in 1989. That man was disappeared very shortly after. One of the reasons why I wanted to show you that was because that film itself and those images are censored in China, and the reason they're censored is because that image itself operates as a kind of a symbol, right? It operates as a symbol of, say, democracy in this case. Here's another symbol of democracy that was created impromptu during that time, and it strikes a resemblance to another symbol, which is the Statue of Liberty. This is another symbol But this is also a metaphoric symbol. So this is an artist named Faith Ringgold. She's an American painter, and she came of age during the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. And here's a quote from her. "We thought of the American flag as our symbol of freedom, but we were losing our freedoms in the 60s. All the blood laying all over the sidewalk, nothing about it in the papers. I mean, silence like it didn't happen." And so she's talking about the harsh crackdown on things like voting rights and the movements of Martin Luther King Jr. and so on, where authorities had a kind of a disproportionate response to the civil unrest that was happening for the demand for civil rights. I thought we'd look at some conventions of representation, not just icons and symbols, but also look at how those icons and symbols are created and communicated in a two-dimensional picture plane. And what perspective, two-dimensional perspective, is one of the most widely used conventions, but it's just that, it's a convention. It doesn't have any relationship to whether or not something is true or not, right? Or more accurate or not. So a lot of times I hear people say, oh, I can't draw well, like it doesn't look like anything. It looks like a this or that. But the thing that I wanted to point out here, and in this image from Abraham Boss on the left, is that when looking at a two-dimensional image in a perspectival plane, one of the things that was really important in that transformation, and especially in terms of the representation of space, is that it prioritized the point of view of the individual. And the individual suddenly, the point of view, the eyes, what one person could see could be conveyed through the image itself simply by virtue of its composition and its relationship to space and how it represented that space. It took a while for people to sort out how to represent things that were closer up than further away, right? Prior to the Renaissance, where people started to kind of look into optics and stuff like that, you had a pictorial representation that was highly symbolic. And if there was any representation of space, it was usually done in the way that an atmospheric perspective might show up. So, for example, you know that people are, in this painting by Duccio di Buonasegna, this painting, you know the people in the front because they're unobstructed. The obstructed people are the ones who are further behind. This is the entire altarpiece. And so you can see that we can look at this image. You could think about this presentation as a kind of an ideological point of view, right? And so I just wanted to show you this because I can always kind of show you this kind of thing, which is more frequently shown in art history lectures. But the thing is that it's a part of a larger altarpiece, and that altarpiece was part of religion and religious ceremony. And so there are many parts of this piece that tell stories, and this is simply one part of it, although a very major part of it. Cultures have developed different ways to represent the illusions of space in two dimensions, and the word perspective comes from the Latin word prospectus, or to look forward, to look ahead. Sometimes, though, what we're looking at can get a little confusing. And so, again, when we have optical illusions are kind of a handy way of showing up the convention that is two-dimensional perspective. And in this case, the question is, which way is the horse looking? What are we looking at here? It could be an aerial map, or it could be something else. This is a different way of representing perspective where it's more atmospheric. And that means that the things that are in the distance are represented by less visible things, thus copying the way that atmosphere hides and obscures things through space and distance. You can see here, this is just lines, but it does convey a sense of space. Again, if you look off to the right and to the left, you can see those grayish forms that represent mountains that are apparently far distant. This is what's called isometric perspective, and so, for example, if you look at the ramp that's going up into the pagoda area, it almost looks like it's getting bigger as it's going up. But what's happening there is it's actually not getting bigger. What's happening is that your brain is so used to reading two-dimensional space or three-dimensional space represented in a linear perspective system where things vanish, a vanishing point, that we overcompensate for that because we know our brain's trying to make it work. So isometric perspective was something that was used in this piece where there is no vanishing point, but it's simply there to represent a space and give an environment to the people who are doing what they're doing. This is an early example of how people were using perspective. These are different vanishing points, so you can see that people are still kind of working it out. Here's a thing that I like to show you. This is an early color study. It's a watercolor of an interior of a church. And the thing that's interesting about linear perspective is that you can lay a pencil or a straight edge along the very bottoms of those columns and line them all up, and then you'll notice that your straight edge is kind of rising a little bit. And then if you keep track of where it winds up toward the left-hand edge of the image, you can also line up your ruler on the very top. And as you do that, and where they intersect at the end, you'll have what's called a vanishing point, or the horizon line. And the horizon line can give you information about just how tall, perhaps, the artist was who was painting this, or perhaps if you knew the location. You could also kind of figure out what, based upon the color, was it in the morning time, was it in the afternoon, was it in the fall, was it in the summer, and so on. So there's a lot of clues in these images that can give you information, not just the obvious ones like icons. Along the lines of perspective, there came an obsession with associating the perspectival, two-dimensional perspectival representation of space with accuracy. And so this is a guy named Henry Fox Talbot using something called the camera lucida, and this is the camera obscura. And the camera obscura was invented in the 6th century by an Arab. And what the optics allowed you to do was to get a more accurate representation of what you were looking at, and you could put down on paper. So Henry Fox Talbot liked to travel, and he used this little thing. You can see that little stick that's poking up to his eye. Well, there's a little tiny lens on there, and a refracting mirror that allows you to see through something straightforward that's in front of you, and then copy it down on a piece of paper. So this is sort of like the earliest snapshot. And same thing with that. I talked a little bit about the cone of vision, so I want you to think about this in your projects. Like, what's your point of view, not simply through what you're representing, but also through how it's represented, from what point of view. If it's multiple points of view, then oftentimes we toss aside any notion that there's a single viewer, for example, AI art. Here's another optical illusion. And another optical illusion, again, this is going to kind of show up our reliance on how much we read things based upon their placement relative to the representation of space in an image. So the question I have for you, which is the smallest fellow in the picture? And you can hold a pencil up to your screen and try to measure them if you'd like. Which one's bigger? And which one of those lines is longer? The red lines. Which one's longer? So this is all by way of showing you that perspective is something that's really important. The reason I'm harping on it is because this way of looking at things, way of representing space, this is Toulouse-Lautrec. This is Toulouse-Lautrec. The reason I'm harping on representation like this is because it has driven a lot of processor development in computers. So when we presume that that a perspectival system is the go-to for accuracy in representing something, and thus the accuracy, therefore, to a certain extent, suspends our disbelief, then that's how movies operate. That's why we can go to a movie and enjoy it with friends. Toulouse-Lautrec was an artist in Paris in the 19th century, and he recorded a lot of the kind of more underground art scenes. He was a little person, and he was very not very tall. And his work reflects that. So, for example, look at the top of the baluster there, the banister there. And so, a lot of times, there's really interesting little cues that give you a sense of like it's almost like we're peeking over the banister. Also, a lot of times looking from below, looking up at people, right? It's not just a representation of who those people are, but it's a representation from a particular height and a particular point of view. This is a drawing that is what's using linear perspective, but it's going up, and the vanishing point is vanishing up. This is another drawing. It's a charcoal drawing. So when things get confused, it's often a mismatch between what we expect to see and what we think we know about how images are supposed to look. However, what we think things are supposed to look like is actually an indication of how we think the convention is supposed to work. Okay, and again, like this is that's to go back to a lot of those visual optical illusions. One of the in the early part of the 20th century, between about like 1906 to about 1912, 13, 14, artists named Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque started to work on a more, in quotes, honest way of representing space. And so I'm going to use my mouse to talk about this. This is a large painting, and I'm going to show you how big it is here. These are an image of prostitutes on Avignon Street, or in Avignon. And what Picasso was doing, he's doing a number of things. He's including African masks or references to African masks in the painting. And at that time, there were a number of African masks coming into Europe owing to colonialism and trade in quotes, the exotic, right? So the non-Western. And those exotic elements had a kind of curiosity to the European artists. Now, Picasso was aware of the different cultures, but one of the things here that he's using this reference to the mask is he's using it as kind of an abstraction in a Western point of view. And some would argue that is in at least at this point in the game, a little bit disrespectful, but nonetheless, it also represents kind of like in terms of symbology, his time, right, where he was from. Also, the other thing he wanted to do was to try to represent space in a way that was more thorough or intellectually thorough than the tricks of the vanishing point. And so in what's called Analytical Cubism, what they did was, like this piece right here, Picasso asked, how do we represent a world on a flat picture plane that never sits still? It's always moving. And so in this case, you can see that you have, like, this is the neck of this woman. She's looking at us, even though this is her back being faced away, right? And these are tapestries or sheets. Perhaps these people are laying on a bed and it's being folded up to show us, right? So again, totally different way of representing space in this painting than we're accustomed to. Here you have a picture of, this is the same painting. You can see there's like a melon, maybe some figs or something like that. And you can see that the table is kind of folded up towards us so we can see it. So he's almost like prioritized what he wants you to look at and painted it that way. All right. So linked to perspective is a pictorial convention known as realism, and photography relies heavily on this. Photos, unlike paintings, offer up seemingly verifiable evidence that whatever was photographed was really there. So photography, we don't usually ask a photo for truth or proof because it is proof, right? But we should. What a photo does is more immediately is to show us how important one's perspective is. So in other words, somebody was holding the camera, somebody was holding it at a certain height, somebody pointed the camera with a choice to point the camera such as they did. They also chose to delete things, right? To crop things out. And we don't really wonder that when it comes to photography, right? So I showed you this before. This is where optics, I have the information on this one, the camera lucida, invented by William Hyde Wollaston, and then an Arab philosopher, Ibn al-Haytham, in the 11th century.